this year, I decided to help coach my son Daniel's baseball team. And it was a ton of fun. My son Daniel, he is 7 years old, and so it's a little bit of chaos in coaching, which is a lot of fun, like herding cats. A lot of fun, but if you've ever played, baseball at that age, or coached kids at that age, or just had kids at that age, you know that every kid's favorite part of any sport are the snacks that come at the end. Right? And so our parents on this team are just amazing. They're absolutely amazing because they don't just bring snacks for the players. They also bring snacks for the coaches, yes, but also they bring snacks for all of the players' siblings. And so my youngest son, Luke, who's 5 years old, loves this. It's his favorite part of all of Daniel's games too, are the treats at the end. Well, a couple weeks ago, one of the parents for the snack at the end of the game brought Pringles, and my son Luke went nuts. He loves Pringles, and so he got his Pringles. He's all excited. He took off to the playground and started playing. Well, a couple minutes later, he just starts sobbing. He lost his Pringles. He was devastated. He is screaming, he is crying, he is just losing his mind because he lost his Pringles. And the parent that brought the Pringles had already left, and so he couldn't get new ones. And so he is just devastated. He's sobbing. We have to pack him up and get to the van because we got to get home. He's screaming in the van. He's crying in the van. My wife and I are looking at each other like, oh, what's going on? And then all of a sudden, silence. And from the back seat, we hear crunch, crunch, and my wife and I, we kind of look at each other, and he's eating Pringles. I'm like, Luke, you found your Pringles. And he goes, no, Daniel gave me his. In that moment, Daniel was Luke's hero. And not just that, he was my hero. He was Abby's hero because the screaming stopped. He was our hero. A few years back, I was out at a leadership conference out in California, and it was the middle of winter, so it was super nice to get away from the cold and get out and get some warm. But at the end of this leadership conference, a few days, I was going to fly home, but to save a couple bucks, I got the red-eye flight back to Minnesota. And so it was going to be, I had to wake up at 2 a.m., there was a layover in Chicago, and then I'd get home at about 4 p.m., so after an exhausting conference, it was going to be a long day. So I got up, exhausted, flew out to Chicago, twiddled my thumbs for way too long, and then finally caught the flight back to Minnesota. And if you've ever flown into the airport in Minneapolis, you know that there's the highway, there's a fence, and then it's the airport. And so we're over the top of the fence, like I can see it out my window, and all of a sudden the plane goes, whoo, and they pull up. I mean, it's fast, like we just shot back up in the air. Apparently there was an ice storm, and the runway was too icy to land. And we didn't have enough fuel to circle the airport, so we went to Fargo. And that's where we landed. And there was no plan. There was no plan for how to feed these people. There was no plan for a flight back home. There was no plan for how do we spend the night. There was no plan for anyone. So I was stranded in Fargo, exhausted, tired, no warm clothes because I didn't think I'd need it. I had no plan. And so out of a little bit of desperation, I called my brother who lives in Alexandria, about halfway between here and Fargo. And I said, hey, Nick, would you mind coming and picking me up? And he dropped everything, drove 2 hours up to Fargo, picked me up, drove me 2 hours back to his place, put me up for the night, fed me, woke up in the morning, drove me 2 hours back home, and then drove himself 2 hours back to his place. In that moment, my brother was my hero. You see, that's what we call people who sacrifice of themselves to serve someone else, right? We call people like that heroes. And every one of us, we have this natural desire to be heroic, don't we? I mean, every one of us wants to be seen and known as a hero, right? To do the heroic thing, to swoop in and save the day, to make the world a better place, right? To do the altruistic thing. We all have this desire to be heroes. But we also know that there's a huge difference between thinking you're a hero and actually being a hero, right? Like we know that there's a difference, and we've met people like this, right? People who will say one thing but then do another thing, right? We know people like this who their words and their actions don't match up. You know what we call people like that? Politicians. No, I'm just kidding. We don't. That's terrible. No, we call them hypocrites. We call those people hypocrites, right? And if you've ever read anything that Jesus has said, you know that Jesus has nothing positive to say about hypocrites, about people who say one thing and do another thing. He has nothing positive to say about those kinds of people. And you see, it's one thing that, like, we can talk all day long about our character. We can say all we want about what our virtues are, right? What we believe. But at the end of the day, it's your actions that are the proof of what you really believe, right? It's what you do with your life that actually proves what you believe. And serving is perhaps the greatest litmus test for your character. And I say that because I see it in Jesus. Like, this is what Jesus' life was all about, serving. It's what his teachings all pointed us towards. If you look at the examples of Jesus when he interacts with other people, almost every interaction that he has with another person is Jesus serving another person. Like, serving is at the very heartbeat of what it means to follow Jesus, right? That Jesus didn't just say nice things, he did them. He followed through, right? To maybe put this a little bit simpler for us, like, we as a church, our job, our call is to listen to Jesus and do what he says. Listen to Jesus and do what he says. You see, Redeemer, we refuse to be a church that merely believes in Jesus. We are a church that follows Jesus, that shows what we believe by how we serve other people. That's who we are at our heartbeat, at the core of who we are. We listen to Jesus and we do what he says. You see, this is so important that listening to Jesus, right? And it's really not hard to listen to Jesus, right? If maybe you're newer to faith or maybe you have a hard time hearing God in prayer, that kind of thing, it's like, you can still hear Jesus. He's given us the Bible, right? The Bible is what God has spoken to us. When you're reading the Bible, you're hearing God's voice to you. Right? We can listen to Jesus, but we also know that he's alive and still speaking today, right? Jesus is still speaking to us in prayer. He's still speaking to us when we're out in nature. He's still speaking to us when we're in conversations with other people. That God is in a constant conversation with us, and our job is to listen to Jesus. But we don't stop there. We also do what he says. You see, this is so important that even Jesus' brother James tells us that, oh, you believe in Jesus? So what? Even the demons believe in Jesus. You see, it's not enough to simply know. It's not enough to simply understand. We have to do what he says. We follow through. It's our actions that are proof of what it is that we believe. We listen to Jesus and do what he says. And you see, all month long, this is why we have taken the month of July and declared it Serve Month. That this entire month is all about taking the heartbeat of Jesus, serving, and actually doing that. To actually go and be developed as people who have the character trait of serving, because that is who Jesus is a servant. And he calls us to serve others as well. We listen to Jesus, and then we do what he says. And this is the invitation that we're going to give you all month long, to listen to Jesus and do what he says. We're going to give this invitation to you as individuals, as families, as groups or communities, maybe even as entire neighborhoods. The invitation this month for you is to listen to Jesus and do what he says, to serve how he says. Now, as the pastoral team and I, as we were kind of praying over this month and where God wanted to lead us in this conversation, we were drawn to a particular part of the Bible, just 2 chapters, actually. And so we're going to spend the entire month of July hunkered down in just 2 chapters of the Bible. We're going to be in John chapter 13 and 14. And we're going to spend the entire month there because in these 2 chapters, Jesus paints such a compelling vision for what it means to serve the way that he has served us. And if we can catch that vision, Redeemer, if you can catch that vision, the world will not be the same. That you can partner with Jesus and do something incredible. So with that, let's jump in. Let's jump into the very beginning of John chapter 13. and see what Jesus has to say. And here's how this whole chapter, this whole story begins. It says, before the Passover celebration, I'll explain Passover in just a minute. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. This is going to be really important because as we go through this whole month, we need to understand that the foundation of all of this is out of a love that Jesus has for his disciples, a love that he has for you and me. It says it was supper time, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Again, Jesus, before anything is about to happen here, Jesus already knew that Judas was going to betray him. But more on that next week. Come back next week. Okay, so Jesus already knew that Judas is going to betray him. And it says this, it says Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything. I want to unpack that in a second. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he, Jesus, got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with a towel he had around him. This is the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, a story perhaps you're familiar with. Now, as we read this, I want to bring your attention back to what was said right in the middle of that whole beginning, that Jesus was given authority over everything. I mean, just sit on that for a second. Jesus had authority over everything, everything. What would you do if you had that kind of authority? What would you do if you had that kind of power, right? That you could have whatever you wanted. You could just have done whatever you wanted to have done. What would you do if you had that kind of authority? That's the kind of authority that Jesus had. I mean, think about this. Jesus could have done anything he wanted to do. He could have made happen anything that he wanted to make happen. Jesus had authority over everything. And how does he choose to use that authority? By serving, right? Jesus uses his authority by blessing others with it, by giving it away. That's how Jesus uses his authority. Now, to understand the story of what's going on, we got to kind of go back to that culture, right? If you go way back to when the story began, right, 2,000 years ago, there were no cars, right? Duh. There were no cars around there, and so people, how they traveled is they just walked. They just walked everywhere, and there were no paved streets. It was all just dusty roads, dusty trails, and that's how they traveled from place to place. That they wore their sandals and they traveled from place to place. Now, like I said, I have coached baseball this last year, and it has been really dry all year long. And at the end of a day of coaching, not even playing a game, of coaching, I would come home with my legs so covered in dust that I'd take my shoes and socks off, and there'd be that nasty line where it was like, gross, pasty white, right? You've seen that before? Yeah. That was me after every baseball game, after every baseball practice. Now, I want you to imagine that. That's how people walked around all the time. In that dusty, just kind of, their feet and leg would just be covered in dust and muck and gross. This is why it was customary. It was kind of the way to be hospitable to people, that when you were going to host people at your house, you would get a servant or a slave to fill a basin of water and wash your guests' feet, right? It was just commonplace to do that. Now, apparently in this story, that never happened, right? And so the supper is about to begin, right? Dinner's about to be served, and everyone's feet are still disgusting. And so Jesus takes advantage of the situation, and he becomes like a slave, like a servant, and washes the disciples' feet. Now, Passover, right? This is the Passover meal. Okay, and Passover wasn't just any ordinary meal. Passover was a celebration. It was an event, right? Like you and I celebrate Christmas or Easter, perhaps, right? That's what Passover was to the Jewish people back then. It was their big celebration. And what Passover was, it was a celebration of what God had done way back in the Old Testament. Way back, if you remember back to Moses going to Pharaoh, let my people go, right? Followed by the 10 plagues. And on the 10th plague was God sending the angel of death, right? To kill the firstborn son of each household. But if you killed a lamb and put its blood on your doorposts, God would pass over your home, right? He would spare you from death. And it was a celebration of God saving their lives, of God sparing them from death. But it was also a celebration of their freedom from slavery, right? Because they were no longer slaves from Egypt. They were now free people. They were free Israelites. So it was this celebration that God saved their lives. It was a celebration that they now were free from being slaves. They had freedom. What I find so compelling about the story of Jesus is that here they are at the Passover meal, this celebration of God sparing their lives, and Jesus is preparing to give his life. Here they are at the celebration, right? The celebration of freedom from slavery. And Jesus is positioning himself as a slave to serve his disciples. It's this incredible contrast that what they were expecting and what they got from Jesus were so dramatically different. You see, this is the litmus test of Jesus' character, right? That Jesus, having all authority over everything, didn't just believe loving things. He didn't just believe that it was right to serve. He actually did that. He proved his character by his actions. He did the things that he said. Now, the story continues, right? Jesus is washing his disciples' feet, and it picks up here. It says, when Jesus came to Simon Peter, the disciple, right? Peter said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you don't understand what I'm doing now, but someday you will. No, Peter protested, you will never wash my feet. And Jesus replied, unless I wash you, you won't belong to me. And so Simon Peter exclaimed, then wash my hands and my head as well, Lord, not just my feet. And Jesus replied, a person who is bathed all over does not need to wash except for the feet to be entirely clean. And you disciples are clean, but not all of you. Again, referring to Judas, which you'll hear more about next week. Just hang on. So it's this bizarre story, right? This weird interaction with Peter. And Jesus, you'll never wash my feet. Okay, now wash everything, right? It's this weird back and forth going on. Now, what's important to understand in this conversation is we have the privilege of knowing how the story ends, right? We know that Jesus is going to die. We know that Jesus is crucified. We know that 3 days later he resurrects back to life. We know all that. The disciples didn't. I mean, put yourself in their shoes here for a minute. The disciples had no idea what was about to come. Here they were just celebrating, right, another Christmas with the family, right, another Easter brunch. It's just another Passover meal that they had an expectation of what was going to happen. And yet what happened was so far from what they had ever experienced, from what they ever expected. Because what happened to Peter was that Jesus, right? Jesus, who had more authority than Peter had. Jesus, who was the honored guest, right? Jesus, who had a better title than Peter had. Jesus, who had better status than Peter had. Jesus positions himself to serve Peter rather than be served by Peter. I mean, to put it maybe a little bit differently, that Jesus, having authority over everything, he sacrificed of himself to serve Peter, to serve his disciples. Sacrifice to serve. Sacrifice to serve. That's what it means to serve other people. To serve the way that Jesus served us is to sacrifice of yourself for the sake of another person. Sacrifice to serve. Now, as I was reading this, it begged the question, why would God do that? Why would Jesus sacrifice of himself, sacrifice of his authority, his status? Why would Jesus do this? I mean, God, who spoke all of creation into existence, why would he choose to serve? Why would he choose to lower himself like that? Well, what Jesus says next should stop you and me in our tracks. What Jesus says next should cause us to evaluate the trajectory our life is headed on, because what Jesus says next is the difference between believing in Jesus and following Jesus. Here's how Jesus follows this up. Here's what Jesus says next. It says, after washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down, and he asked, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. Right? I've given you an example to follow. Now do as I have done to you. You see, it's not enough to merely believe that Jesus was a servant. It's not enough to just merely believe that Jesus did great things, right? To believe that sacrificing to serve is the right. It's not enough. We also have to do what he says, right? We listen to Jesus and we do what he says. This is what it means to move from a believer to a follower. Somebody who follows in the example, in the footsteps of their Lord and Savior. Somebody who follows Jesus. To serve the way that Jesus serves us. To sacrifice of ourselves to serve other people. Now for me, this is the point of the story where I have to pause and evaluate, so why don't I do this? Right? What keeps me from doing this? What keeps me from serving the way that Jesus served? And here's the deal. We all have excuses, right? And we all typically have our go-to things because serving other people isn't easy. So I need to ask you the same question that I wrestle with. What keeps you from serving people? I mean, just for you personally, what keeps you from serving people? Because here's the deal. We all know that serving is good. We all know that serving is right. Like, listen, we know this, right? So why don't we do this? Why don't you do this? Why don't I do this? What is it for you that keeps you from serving? Perhaps for you, the thing that keeps you from serving is how inconvenient it is. That maybe for you like convenience because, hello, I like convenience. I like things that are easy for me, right? And serving other people can be really hard because it can sometimes mean being inconvenienced, right? I like my plans. I like to set out my things. I like to know exactly what I'm doing. And when God says, hey, but hold on, go serve that person, it screws up everything, and I don't like it. It's inconvenient. But perhaps for you, and perhaps for me, the invitation Jesus has for you is to sacrifice your convenience for the sake of serving another person. What keeps you from serving? Maybe for you it's comfort, because man, do we love our comfort, right? We love the nice comfy seats that we've got. You know, maybe you're watching on the couch, we like our comfortable seats. We love our air conditioned, but not too cold, but just right? We love comfort. We love to be comfortable, and serving can be really uncomfortable sometimes. Can I ask you a question? Who makes you uncomfortable? I'll tell you who makes me uncomfortable. People who are homeless make me uncomfortable. I don't know what it is. I don't know why this is the case. They're just human beings like me. But for whatever reason, I get uncomfortable when I'm around people who are homeless. And for someone like me, that's a place that God is challenging me. Is don't just not serve somebody because it makes you uncomfortable. Perhaps for you, the invitation is to sacrifice your comfort for the sake of serving another person. What keeps you from serving other people? Like for you, what is it? Is it your stuff? Is it your possessions? Right? For some of you, if God told you, hey, go and give that person your phone. Hey, go and gift that person your car. I mean, you'd rather walk away from your faith than do something like that. Because maybe for you, you don't own your stuff owns you, right? And perhaps the thing for you is maybe God is inviting you to sacrifice your possessions, to sacrifice of your wealth, to sacrifice of your stuff for the sake of another person. What is it for you? What keeps you from serving? We all have a list of things that keep us from serving. Maybe it's your importance. Maybe you are a really important person in your sphere of influence. And the idea of serving someone like that, right? Actually going and getting coffee for my coworkers, right? Actually stopping what I'm doing to pick up some trash. That's just below me because I'm too important. And perhaps for you, the invitation is to sacrifice your importance for the sake of another person. Maybe it's your time, maybe it's your energy. What is it for you? Maybe it's the authority that you've actually been given. What keeps you from serving? And perhaps the answer to that question is the very thing that Jesus is saying, that's what I want you to sacrifice so that you can serve another person, so that you can love someone the way that I've loved you. And in that, maybe that's the space that God wants to grow your capacity to love, is by sacrificing that thing. What is it for you? You see, Jesus sacrificed to serve. We see this all over the place. And it changed the world forever. Right? Now, I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Imagine what God might do through you if you listened to Jesus and did what he said. That's the invitation of Serve Month. That's the invitation that Jesus extends to you and me, is to listen to him, but then follow through, to do the thing that he's called you to do. Listen to Jesus. Jesus, how do you want me to serve? And when he gives you an answer, go and serve that way. Do the thing that he has called you and invited you to do. That this is proof of your character. This is proof of what it is that you believe. That if you are a follower of Jesus, follow Jesus. Now, this is also why during Serve Month, Redeemer, right, the organization, we are not going to give you an endless list of ways to serve, okay? Because Serve Month is not listen to Redeemer and do what Redeemer says. That's not what this is. It's listen to Jesus and do what he says. We want you as individuals, you as families, you as groups and communities, as neighborhoods, to get together and listen to Jesus. And then you do what he says. Now, Redeemer, we are going to give you a couple on-ramps, a couple opportunities that you can serve in, because it's important that we as a family can do this together. That we don't just serve as individuals, we serve as a team, as a community, as a family. And so I want to give you a heads up of what's coming this month. These are things that you can expect from Serve Month, okay? That we're going to just set out for you. But listen, just because we've set it out to you doesn't mean that Jesus is calling you to do this. You need to listen to Jesus and then do what he says. So here's what we are doing, okay? When you sat down today, you saw one of these, okay? This is a shopping list of supplies for backpacks. If you're watching online, you can get this as a PDF on our website as well. But this every year for the past number of years, we have partnered with our local Fridley School District, and we pack school supplies into a backpack, and we give them to families who maybe can't afford to give their kids a new backpack and new school supplies every year. And so we partner with our local schools, and we pack backpacks. We put those together, and we give them to families. We just bless people in our community, because this is what God has called us to do. And so for you, maybe God is calling you or your family to pack a backpack. Maybe it's 2 backpacks. Maybe it's 10 backpacks. I don't know. Listen to Jesus and do what he says. But this is one of the things we're going to be inviting you to this Serve Month, is to pack backpacks, to get some school supplies. The second way that we're going to invite you to participate this Serve Month is to join a team and serve at Redeemer. You see, when you become part of a family, you find your place to serve the family, right? And this is why we're praying for 100% participation in serving through Redeemer, of you joining a team in order to serve others here at Redeemer. And we're going to have all kinds of opportunities, ways for you to get involved, ways for you to volunteer, get on a team and serve. And one of those ways, too, is not just to serve locally here at Redeemer, but to serve globally by perhaps going on a mission trip to Tijuana, Mexico. That as you listen to Jesus, maybe that's the place that he's calling you to serve. And later this year, next year, you get to go and build a home for a family that doesn't have one. So we're going to invite you into opportunities to join a team and serve. And as a little side perk to this, if you've ever felt disconnected from a church community, there is no greater way to get connected than to get on a team and serve with other people. This is such an incredible way to feel connected and to be part of a family, to serve like Jesus served. The third way that we're going to invite you to serve this Serve Month is to share your story. Share your serve story. That is, one of the greatest ways to inspire other people to serve like Jesus is for you to do it yourself and then share what God did in you, what God did through you, what God showed you, how he spoke to you. It's so powerful when you get to share your story. That even Jesus himself says, let your light shine before others, right? Let your good deeds be seen before people so that they may praise your Father in heaven. Let people see, let people hear. At the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, Jesus says that we will defeat Satan, we'll defeat the devil by the blood of the Lamb, Jesus, and by the word of our testimony, by sharing what God is doing in us and through us. And so we're inviting you to share your serve story so that we can share that and celebrate that with one another, what God is doing here. You can share your story by going to our website, redeemermn.org, and it'll pop up, will show up right there. You can click that, or you can just write it down on a piece of paper and give it to me, give it to one of our pastoral team. But share your story. And the fourth and final way that we're going to be inviting you to serve is by participating in what we call Go Serve Sunday. That on July 30th, the last Sunday in July, there will be no services, just you serving. On July 30th, we're doing church in reverse. That instead of coming to church, we are going to go be the church. That you, on that day, we're clearing the calendar so that you have space, that you have room to listen to Jesus and then do what he says. On July 30th, we're inviting you to participate in Go Serve Sunday and go serve our community, your neighbors, and be a blessing to other people, to love people the way that Jesus has loved you. Now, all those things, Redeemer, we're not asking you to do everything. All we're asking you is to listen to Jesus and do what he says. That's what Serve Month is all about. That's it. This month, we are praying that God would transform lives through your serving and that God would transform your life as you serve as well. Amen? Amen. Would you bow your heads? I'd love to pray. God, thank you for being so good. Thank you for being a servant. Though you are God of everything, though you have authority over all things, you choose to serve. Thank you. If you're here today and perhaps you believe in Jesus, but you've perhaps never actually followed him. You believe in the church stuff, you believe in the Bible, but if you were to look at your life, there's maybe not much that really says that you're following the things that Jesus has set out for you. Today, I want to extend an invitation for you to say yes to follow Jesus. That if you've never said yes to following him, or maybe today you're just feeling that little nudge of God saying it's time to start following. If that's you right now in this moment, as a declaration, as a response to the invitation of Jesus to follow him, if that's you, would you raise your hand high as a way of saying, Jesus, I follow you? If that's you, raise your hand. Beautiful. I see you. It's beautiful. If that's you, raise your hand high. Beautiful. You can put your hands down. If that was you today, I want to invite you into a very simple prayer. A conversation that you can begin with Jesus of simply, Jesus, I give you my life. I'm following you. That's it. Jesus, I give you my life. I'm following you. There's a much greater conversation you're going to be able to have with him later, but But perhaps that's the place that it needs to begin. Jesus, I give you my life, and I'm following you. Jesus, thank you for the way that you serve us. Lord, may we participate with you in being servants to others as well. In your name, amen. Amen. Redeemer, can we celebrate those who said yes to following Jesus today?